Welcome to the New Life Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching.
Peggy found out that her husband had another woman by accident when she went to the dry cleaners to pick up his suit, and with the suit she was given a huge, colorful dress. She said it was a mistake, but the girl with the stern glasses poked her manicured finger into the ledger. That's right, one-piece blue wool suit, one-piece floral silk dress. In the movies, the mistresses are always young and slim. Peggy's rival was the same age as her and wore clothes 2 sizes larger than Peggy herself, who after 50 began to gain weight, but not critically. At least the sales drills did not suggest that she go to the big box store. This one could use some. Tony, what's that? She asked her husband quietly that evening, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from screaming. Somehow she thought her husband would deny it, tell a story about a third aunt or something like that. But her husband sank heavily into the armchair, covered his face with his hands, and said in a muffled voice, "I love her." It turned out he'd been living on 2 houses for a year, and it also turned out that Peggy knew her rival perfectly well. It was a hairdresser, Cora, to whom she had once made an appointment while her hairdresser was on vacation. She didn't like the haircut, it was too short, and she never went to her again. How she and Tony had gotten together was a mystery, and she didn't ask for fear she'd scream. Screaming wasn't her style. Peggy had always prided herself on her poise. They divorced quietly, with no arguments or drama. Tony, happy with such a successful arrangement, left her the apartment but took the country house and the car. His Cora turned out to be an avid gardener and had already planned what varieties of tomatoes and radishes will grow there. Peggy herself had never liked the house, so she was not particularly upset. She didn't drive a car, so she didn't feel the loss either. But it was hard without her husband, whom she thought she had never really loved. Either she had gotten used to him, or she was not at the right age to be alone. Her daughter wanted to fly down from Chicago, but Peggy talked her out of it. They'd never been very close anyway. She'd only be teaching her about life as usual. "Mom, you've got to work. You can't stay at home anymore. Mom, look at the senior program. You can study and then get a job. Mom, what's that coat you're wearing? Did you steal it from the coat check lady at the museum?" No, Peggy didn't need that right now, but she had to admit her daughter was right, and she should have worked. But Tony didn't want Peggy to work. He liked to have hot meals and sterile cleanliness at home. His mother was a doctor and had accustomed him to cleanliness from childhood. And Peggy had a lot to do with her daughter: ballet, French, tutors. And why it only fiddled, it is unclear. Now works as a dancer, dances half-naked on stage. Had Peggy known, did not spend so much effort and money. When Peggy went to her first interview, she was sure she'd be hired. When she went for her 15th, she knew she'd be turned down. Some kind woman in line recommended that she go to the unemployment office. By then Peggy was almost out of money, and she was ashamed to ask her daughter. At the employment office, she was met by a surly young woman who also apparently had to dress in an oversized store. She absent-mindedly looked at her documents and asked, "So you haven't worked anywhere since you were 23? Is that against the law?" Peggy shrieked. The girl snorted. "And you're an architect by training. Do you know that in 30 years this field has changed somewhat? What are you implying, that I'm out of touch with life? By the way, I've mastered the smartphone faster than my daughter. She still can't process photos." The girl looked at her more closely. "Do you have a daughter?" "Of course I do." "And how old is she?" "Yeah, she'll be 30 soon. But what's she got to do with it? I need a job, not her. Although, you should know what she does, shame on you. I spent my whole life on her. I haven't worked for 30 years and she—" The girl closed the folder and said, "Okay, my name is Lawrence, and I'm hiring you. I need someone to help me communicate with my mom." Peggy stared at her in surprise. "What does that have to do with me?" "Because you look just like my mom. The psychologist told me that I can't solve my problems until I learn to communicate properly with my mother. How do you do that? No matter what I say, she's never happy. So I was thinking maybe you could answer to her for me. You know, with the right words. She'll stop scolding me and I'll stop eating nonstop. How about that?" Yes, the suggestion was so ridiculous that Peggy laughed. She stood up, picked up her papers and said, "I think I'm beginning to understand your mother. I've never heard such nonsense in my life." Peggy had already gone to the door, but she turned around. The girl's face was wrinkled, and she was sniffing her nose childishly. Her daughter had cried like that when she was a child. Peggy stopped. "All right," she said. "I'll tell everyone I got a job as a psychologist. I'll tell them I took a refresher course." It didn't go well at first, with Lawrence calling her, reading her mother's messages, asking her what to say. Peggy would dictate and Lawrence would argue. Sometimes Lawrence gave up and answered something in the middle, and the results were not long in coming. Her mother didn't swear so much, and Lawrence didn't eat so much. On Saturdays, Lawrence had calls with her mom, and on those days Peggy would come to her apartment. Lawrence would put the conversation on speakerphone and Peggy would write her answers on a piece of paper. Lawrence's relationship with her mother had really improved, although even Peggy herself recognized that Lawrence's mother was overreacting. Yes, the girl was overweight, but was that a reason to scold her? The poor girl was already running to the toilet after every meal. Is that really the point? "Where's your father?" Peggy asked, thinking that maybe he had a mistress too, and that's why Lawrence's mother was so angry. "He died years ago when I was a little girl," said Lawrence. "I was so angry with him when I was a little girl. I mean that he left us. I didn't realize then that death can't be stopped. We had no money and nothing to eat. Sometimes I think that's why I eat so much. I've had enough and I can't stop." I felt sorry for that girl. Even though Peggy had already found a normal job as a movie theater supervisor, I still helped her. After the Saturday calls with her mother, they had tea and talked. At first it was nothing, then Lawrence began to share with her amorous affairs, and Peggy told her about her husband and his mistress, and about her daughter working as a dancer. "May I tell that to my mother?" laughed Lawrence. "She doesn't like my work." Surprisingly, Peggy even told her sister. "We've always been so friendly, we've never had a fight in our lives. And then I fell in love. His name was Roger, tall, handsome, a mechanic. But I was proud and told him he was no match for me. Holly, my sister, of course, knew I liked him. And she said I was stupid. Well, the truth is, I was a professor's daughter, well-bred, well-educated. And what was he? I was stupid, of course. I went to my grandmother's for the summer, and when I came back, these two were already dating. So I told my sister she'd ruin her life and left for good." "What do you mean forever?" Lawrence didn't understand. "Literally. We didn't see her 3 times at my father's funeral, at my mother's funeral, and at the notary's office when we made the will. He took her away with him, and I got married to Tony." "And you're still not in touch?" Peggy swallowed the lump that was stopping her breathing and said, "She died 2 years ago, and you didn't even go to the funeral?" "I didn't," Hetty confirmed. Lawrence shook her head. "Yeah, I think you need a psychologist more than I do. Well, you know what? You should go to her grave, her sister, and talk to her like she's alive. I did that, I talked to my dad, and it made me feel better. It really helps." Peggy didn't take the advice seriously at first, but for some reason the thought wouldn't go away. She remembered Roger's phone call and how her lips had gone numb, and she couldn't say a word, whether from the horror of not being able to believe that her sister was gone, or because his voice still had power over her, and the sound of his voice made her heart race. She hadn't said anything to Tony, and she hadn't gone to the funeral. She didn't want to see her sister dead, couldn't face Roger without giving herself away. She knew the address. Her sister had written letters to them over the years, enclosing pictures of herself and the children. Peggy cropped off the generic photos of Roger, hiding them in a separate folder. It's a good thing neither her daughter nor Tony found that folder. What would have happened if she had died just as suddenly? And one of them, going through her things, found those mutilated cards. After tossing and turning in bed until 3 in the morning, Peggy got up and bought a ticket to Boston. Quickly, before she changed her mind. And then she fell asleep so soundly that in the morning she didn't hear the alarm clock and slept through the night for the first time in years. Lawrence approved of her decision and said she could probably manage without Peggy's help. "Maybe I'll even go to visit her," she said uncertainly. Peggy had met a lovely young couple on the train, and they were going on a wedding trip. It was a strange decision to go on a wedding trip by train, but everyone had their quirks. They had told her where to stay in Boston and where to find out where the burial place was. The girl was from there and had lived there until she was 15. After putting her suitcase down and washing up from the road, Peggy called the cemetery office. It was strange to say her sister's name. Her mouth felt bitter and her eyes felt like hot air. Peggy rehearsed what she would say to Holly, that she forgave her and held no more grudges, that she regretted the years she had ignored her letters, though she read them all carefully and even reread them, putting them in stacks. The words were not fitting well, not wanting to come out of her mouth. Peggy sighed, changed into a strict dress. She was going to the cemetery after all. Noted that it hung on her. Whether from worrying or looking at Lawrence, Peggy had eaten much less, and was even satisfied with her reflection in the mirror. She decided to buy flowers near the cemetery, for they probably sold them there. She left the room, taking only her purse, walked down the hall and down the stairs. She ran into a man in a plaid suit at the door, and he let her through, holding the heavy door open for her. "Peggy." His voice made her heart skip a beat. If it hadn't been for the pictures her sister had sent her over the years, Peggy wouldn't have recognized him. Roger had changed a lot since the last time they'd seen each other, and neither had she, but he recognized her, even though Peggy hadn't sent any pictures of herself. She stopped, not knowing what to do next. He stepped forward and held her tightly to his chest. He smelled of lemon and seawater. "How are you doing, Peggy? Why didn't you call?" She stood like a statue, not lifting her arms for a hug, not even a smile. Peggy had thought the feeling had withered and withered over the years, but now it was rising up inside her, braiding its branches, blooming with strange flowers that smelled of lemon and seawater. "I wanted to go to Holly's grave," she said with difficulty, realizing that further silence would be too strange. "I didn't want to bother anyone, so I decided to stay at a hotel." Roger laughed. "So this is my hotel. I didn't want to go today, but the pipe in the basement had burst, so I thought I'd check it out myself. Peggy, it's so good to see you. You haven't changed a bit. You know what? I'll get the girls to make you some coffee with cream, just the way you like it. You still like it with cream, don't you? I'll go and do some quick errands, take you to the cemetery, and then back to our place." "No, no, 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 no. The kids are coming over tonight. You haven't seen them, have you? I'll have your things moved to our place. I was going to call you, but I was afraid you wouldn't answer." He waved his hands and stopped talking. And Peggy suddenly realized that all her fears and resentments all these years have been only in her head. She felt an acute longing for a time that could never be brought back, for a sister whom she had not known for most of her life through her own stupidity. And she said, "All right, let's do as you say." At the cemetery, Roger delicately stepped aside. Peggy couldn't say anything to her sister, but she could look at the picture of her as an adult, with kind eyes like her mother's, and she promised she'd come back here again. The house turned out to be cozy, a little cluttered, but still nice. It felt like it was missing a woman's hand and could use a good cleaning. "Don't any of your children want to live with you?" she asked Roger, trying to keep her voice lighthearted. "No," he sighed. "My daughter-in-law doesn't like private homes, and my daughters have a long commute to work. But they take turns visiting me. Thank you for your concern. It's so nice. I realize you've hated me all these years, thought I was no match for your sister. But I swear I've been a good husband, and I've never hurt her. To be honest, when I was young, I dreamed of marrying you." "Why are you looking at me like that? You were so beautiful. You still are." Peggy stood there puzzled. What is he talking about? "Are you sick?" Roger was frightened. "Sit down here and I'll get some water." He scurried into the kitchen. Peggy sank into a chair and closed her eyes. So it wasn't as bad as she'd thought. She had been afraid that both her sister and Roger knew of her unrequited love, that they were pitying her and perhaps laughing at her. But it turned out that they both thought Peggy simply disliked him. Just then something touched her feet. She was startled, opened her eyes. There was a shaggy dog curled up at her feet. It was grunting softly, trying to rest its head on her shoes. "Vega?" Roger wondered. He stood like that in the doorway with a glass of water, mouth open. "Is that your dog?" It was a silly question. Peggy realized it was theirs, not a stranger off the street. "She hasn't let anyone near her since Nastia died," he said quietly. "It was her dog. She doesn't recognize me or the children. She even bit me recently." He showed her his hand, though there were no bite marks, but Peggy understood the gist of the statement. She bent down and gently stroked the dog. At that moment the phone rang. She cringed. What bad timing. She tried to reset it, but saw that it was Lawrence. Poor girl, she must have had another fight with her mom. "Hello? Peggy, it's Lawrence. How's it going? I'm sorry to call, but I think I'm making progress. After we talked, I figured, if you've been able to come after all these years, why can't I just visit my mom? Especially since sooner or later she's going to make me do it anyway. So I bought a cake and I went. And I only ate one piece. She told me again that I was fat, but no one would want me like that. And when I showed her Mark's picture, she said she could see in my eyes that he was a scoundrel. But I held on and didn't disagree with her. And I didn't cry. But then, at night, I snapped. I went to the kitchen, got the cake, sat on the floor and started eating it with a spoon right out of the box. Eating it and crying. She came in, saw it, took the spoon and sat next to me. So we sat there in silence eating the cake, smearing tears on our cheeks. And then she suddenly said, "I was so afraid that a boy would be born. He used to beat me, your father. He never left a mark. I couldn't even complain to anyone. And I was afraid my son would be the same. But then you were born. And I was even more afraid. I realized you'd grow up to be just like me. And you'd be beaten too. And you'd have to give birth too. I wanted you to have a different life. Do you understand?" And I told her that when my ex called me fat, I slapped him and kicked him out of the house. And my mom and I laughed, can you believe it? And then she said, "You're not fat, you're so beautiful, my daughter." Then I cried, and she cried. We were in cake and tears, but so happy. I threw that cake away. I didn't want to eat it anymore. And I didn't want to fight with her anymore. I'm sorry, I keep talking and talking. How are you? Peggy looked at the framed picture of her sister, at the dog nestled at her feet. She didn't look at Roger, but she could feel his back. "I'm fine," she said. "I think everything's going to be all right now."